The Promised Land, Lesson 6, the Roman Empire. We've gone through all the way from the time of our purpose has been able to find is finding out who belongs in that land and who has lived in the land that we call the Promised Land. And we started with Abraham and the covenant because we are Christian people and we follow the Judeo-Christian principles. And what happened in the Old Testament has an effect on who we are. So I started with Abraham, and we've gone all the way through the different empires, the different kingdoms, and so on. And tonight we're going to get into talking about the Roman Empire. With that said, I have two maps up here. This one I had last week, and this is of the Hasmonean Empire, or kingdom, or dynasty, however how you want to look at it. And all these different colors on this one are the different leaders of the kingdom and who conquered what lands, and they added different ones. But at the end, by the time they finished, this empire ran from like 140 to like 40 for about 100 years in the 2nd century before Christ, BC. BCE in the way that the secular world refers to it, but it's BC, before Christ. But anyway, this is the territory that it wound up covering, the Sea of Galilee, the Jordan River, the Dead Sea. And so you see land over on this side. This is where Israel is today, and down past here a little bit. But they had this land on this side of the Jordan as well as on this side of the Dead Sea. This is the way that it looked. This is about 40 BC, and I did this map because I want us to look at something. I want you to try to kind of remember some of these names. This shows you the areas, and you can see up here the Roman province of Syria. Rome was beginning to spread down into this area by this time. And the way this was divided up, if you look at it, I don't know if you can read it from where you're sitting, but this is Galilee, this is the Sea of Galilee, this is Decapolis. Do you remember anything that happened in Decapolis, the town of Gadara in the New Testament? You remember the Gadarenes when the demoniac was there that would hung out in the tombs and he would scream at night and all that kind of, and Jesus cast out the demons and they asked if they could come into the hogs and so on. This happened in the area of Decapolis because, in fact, I'll probably mention this later on, but this area was it was under Jewish authority, but they never insisted they become Jews, and so they were rather a rough group of people. So anyway, this is Decapolis, then Galilee, Samaria, Perea, Judea, and Idumea, which you see down here at the bottom. So kind of keep those in mind as we go. And this is a quote that we're going to start with, is the Hasmonean kings expanded their borders drastically, annexing the neighboring territories of Transjordan, including the 10 Hellenized cities of Decapolis. When you see something that says Hellenized, that means it's Greek. It has a Greek influence. Samaria, Galilee, Edom, which became or is called Idumea. By the end of the 2nd century BCE, therefore, the Jewish state had regained something like the borders of ancient Israel at its height under King David and King Solomon. So you can see once again that under this empire for a 100-year period of time, the Jews were pretty much under self-rule again, and they ruled in the land, and there were more people, more Jews coming into the land. But up until this period, there had never been a time when there were not Jews living in this area. There was different times when different ones were taken into captivity into Assyria in the northern kingdom and out of Judea into Babylon during the Babylonian Empire and so on. But it was not all of them by any stretch of the imagination. Some of them escaped during the Babylonian Empire. They went to Egypt. I'm thinking Jeremiah did, if I remember correctly. I had to go back and check. But there were several of them went to Egypt instead, but there were still Jews in this land. There were still the children of Israel in this land, although it's not as many inhabitants as before, and it was a mixed group of people. But at this particular time, it became more and more a Jewish empire, or a Jewish kingdom, a Jewish dynasty, if you will, again, and the Jewish people were living there. So they had been living. So if you go back to the time of Abraham, you're talking about roughly 2000 BC. So from 2000 BC up until this time here that we're talking about tonight, which would be around 40 BC, the Jews had lived in that land. So that's a couple thousand years they had been there, and this had been their homeland. It went by different names. It went by Canaan, and various tribes, various regions, and so on. But in the Bible, in the Old Testament, you read about the land of Canaan, and this is where the land of Canaan was. It was, well, I won't go there. Continuing that quote, none of these areas had been part of the Jewish or Israelite state for hundreds of years. It seemed that in some of the newly annexed territories, the Jewish authorities gave their populations a choice. Now look at the choice they gave them. Convert to Judaism or leave. That kind of narrows it down. This certainly happened in Idumea, or people pronounce that different ways. I pronounce it any way I want to because nobody knows the difference anyway. This certainly happened in Idumea. Some of the newly Jewish families clearly prospered under their new masters. A generation later, an Idumean called Antipater gained control of the Jewish state. So keep in mind the name Antipater as we go forward here. 5 years after the miracle of Hanukkah, there were only two of the Maccabees, the head of the family that was left, and that was Jonathan and Simon. So we're going to pick up from there. And we're going to go to the book of Maccabees, 1 Maccabees, 10th chapter, verse 18. It says, King Alexander to his friend Jonathan, greetings, I have heard that you are a brave man who has earned the right to be a friend of the king. I have this day appointed you as high priest of your nation and conferred upon you the title of friend of the king. You are to be only ally and give us support. Only our ally and give us support. So Alexander says he's going to appoint him high priest. Did Alexander have the authority to appoint anybody a high priest? He was a Greek. He wasn't a Jew. He didn't have the authority to do that, but he did that. What was happening at that time was basically a civil war among the Seleucids, which were of the northern kingdom of what was left of the Grecian Empire, and it was Demetrius, I think it was. Both of them claimed the title of the king of this area, and they were at war with each other. So King Alexandria writes him a letter to get him to side with him and to be loyal to him in this particular conflict. So around 53 to 152 BC is when Jonathan became high priest. Was he qualified to be high priest? That's the first question. Did Alexander have the authority to appoint him high priest? That's the next question. As he was captured and executed by the Greeks, leaving Simon to be the only one left to rule over the Hasmonean kingdom. So we've gotten down to Simon and Jonathan. Now Jonathan has been executed, so that leaves us with Simon. Still talking about the same empire. Simon was not only king after his brother Jonathan's death, he was high priest as well. So he was king and he was high priest of this particular time. There's a reason I'm getting to details here. He also elected to make an alliance with the Roman Empire. Okay, who was it that came in to make, it was Alexander, to make a treaty with his brother Jonathan, and here he's making an alliance with the Roman Empire. So the Roman Empire is coming down to this area, so you can see some conflict coming. Here we have the Romans coming down, you have the Greeks, because really this is getting towards the end of the Grecian Empire. They deployed the 10th Legion to Israel. Problem with that is they never left. They stayed there, And they were the ones, you can see here, that wound up in 70 A.D. destroying the temple in Jerusalem and conquering the people in many years later. So it didn't turn out well from this, 220 years something that they were there. So once they came there, they never left. So they were quite a problem. His son, John Hyrcanus, was to conquer and convert the Idumeans, a tribe in the south of the land of Israel, by the point of the sword. He went in and conquered them all and said, what did he say you had to do? You either become a Jew or you leave, you go somewhere else. Simon was assassinated. You notice all people get killed at this time by a son-in-law who was bribed by the Syrian Greek leaders. His oldest son, John Hyrcanus, a fierce warrior, immediately rushed to Jerusalem, his father's place, and he took the place of high priest and king. So it's going down one right after another, but they're still taking the position of high priest and king. If you go back in the Mosaic law, was there any place, and from the time the kings were first appointed in Israel, was there any provision made for high priests to be king as well? The first king of Israel, what tribe was he from? Just give you a test here, quick test. He was the tribe of Benjamin. Very good. Who was the second king? What tribe? No, he was Judah. Judah. King David and King Solomon were from the tribe of Judah. But they were not of the tribe of Levi, which was the priestly line. The priestly line was the tribe of Levi. So there was no provision under Jewish law for this to occur, and really no authority for any Greek to appoint anybody high priest in the first place. Now, the Maccabees were in a position, they were of the seed of Levi, so they could have been of the high priest, they could have been of the priesthood, so that's not a problem there. But anyway, he was assassinated, and John Hyrcanus takes his place. John helped strengthen, I'm going to read you some of the things he did. John helped strengthen the Torah education system in the land, was personally scrupulous in his observance of the Jewish law, raised the bar regarding the service in the temple, all good things. He even improved the temple edifice. In other words, the temple itself, he improved the ground, he improved the temple, and so on. So all this was good. He threw the Greeks out and kept the Romans pinned down around Caesarea, which is around the coast. We won't get to Caesarea tonight, but we'll next time. He took over vast areas of what is today Jordan and repopulated the Golan, which you hear today talking about the Golan Heights. The Israelis took over in the 73 war, I think it was, to be a buffer between them and Syria and their enemies. So anyway, you hear about the Golan Heights. That's the particular region they're talking about here. He pushed the border of Israel all the way to the outskirts of Damascus up in the north. He also took the seaport of Jaffa, and Jews became partners with the Phoenicians in shipping and trade, which were the northern kingdom, Tyre, Sidon, Byblos, all those cities. They became trading partners with them. So he increased their trading. He conquered more lands. The kingdom became more prosperous. All this under John Hyrcanus. Under his reign, a large immigration of Jews immigrated from Babylon. So more Jews came back from Babylon, came all the way over and settled in Israel, in where the Maccabeans were, the Hasmonean Empire was. In short, he brought the country prosperity and greatness. Where did he go wrong? Have you ever noticed that, what's the last perfect president we've had? We never had one. I can take I won't say tonight who's my favorite of all the presidents of my lifetime, but I can take my favorite presidents of my lifetime and tell you things I didn't like that they did. None of them have been perfect. If they'd been perfect, they'd have done it my way. Right? And that way it would go. So what did he do wrong? One of the great Torah leaders in the early days of the Second Temple was Antigonus of Sochar. Here's what he said. Do not be like servants who serve God on the condition of receiving reward. Rather, be like servants who serve God without expecting reward. Good advice. Antigonus, we're going to talk about a group of people here, and you can see that if you read a little further. And so I want to go to a man by the name of Antigonus. This is in this kingdom at this particular time. Antigonus had two followers named Zadok and Boethus, but interpreted his words as meaning that there was no reward or punishment, no world to come. If you do God's will, fine. If you don't do God's will, nothing's going to happen. When you die, you're just dead. Nothing's going to happen. This became some of the leaders. This to tell you who they were. It was one thing to have these ideas, but another to have a whole movement based on what they called Judaism. This wasn't Judaism if it taught this, but they taught that. Just so happened they were the wealthy class. They were the ruling class of Jews. They were a group called the Sadducees. And they get their name from Zadok, or some of them say Boethus from him. But in the New Testament, we read about the Sadducees. This is who the Sadducees were. They didn't believe in the afterlife. If you remember, they had discussions. The only thing that brought them together was their hatred of Jesus. That's really the only thing that brought them together. But the minority was the Sadducees. The majority was the Pharisees. And the Pharisees were the ones that adhered to the law. The three planks of their party platform was no life hereafter, no reward, no punishment. There was no such thing as the oral tradition that they had. The priestly class is the ruling class. In other words, they were of the priestly line. They were of the priestly class, so they're the ruling class. Sadducees started a whole domino effect about the interpretation of the divine origins and so on. They began to veer from the teachings of the Torah, from the Old Testament that we call it, from the Jewish Bible. They began to change the teachings to match what they liked, but they were the rulers of the temple. This was the beginning of the conflict between the Sadducees and the Pharisees. I got written here, the Sadducees were the Torah sages, the traditional Jews. Another group that was traditional Jews were the Essenes in Qumran, where the Dead Sea Scrolls, they were the ones that attributed to storing the Dead Sea Scrolls. They were probably more strict than the Pharisees were. The Hebrew word for Pharisee is perusim, means to separate, because they separated themselves from the Hellenists, from the Greeks, and all outside influences. They attempted to remain in a pristine, unique state of Judaism. They were going to be Jews, and they were going to practice the law to the nth degree. Where did they go wrong? Where did the Pharisees go wrong? They took the law and then they carried it further and further and further. They added to the law. And I've used this example many times, but I like it because it's indicative of what they did. They had a whole group. Well, for instance, a particular law that they came up with: if somebody came to your door on the Sabbath begging for food, if they reached inside your door, you could give them food, but you couldn't reach outside your door to give them food, because that was work. You couldn't tie a knot on the Sabbath unless you could tie it with one hand, unless you were tying a knot to hold up your underwear. Now, that's written in their law. That's written, and part of what they say. I've never. We won't get carried away with that. But they were very sincere about keeping the law. But what happens when you spend so much time being adherents to the law and you leave out grace? You become more and more and more legalistic. Okay, you had the Sadducees here who are getting further and further and further away from the Torah, and the Pharisees are not only going with the Torah, they're getting further and further than what the Torah even teaches. Josephus, first century Jewish historian who was a Roman citizen, and others point out how the majority of the Jewish people sided with the Pharisees. You'll see that 75 to 80% did. However, the Sadducees were a very powerful minority. They were part of the wealthy aristocratic class. They were part of the government. They were the ones that ruled the temple. They determined who was going to be priest, who was not going to be priest, and so on. They ruled think about this now. They were ruling the temple class pretty much, and they were atheists for all intents and purposes. If they believed in God, which they said they did, but they didn't believe in the afterlife. They didn't believe in any punishment. They believed when you died, you're dead. So what's the difference in them and atheists? The situation would lead to all-out war between Jewish factions, a very uncivil civil war. It'd be a political, religious struggle, conflict that would last for 100 years and generate enough enmity to tear apart the Jewish state from the inside in ways outside enemies could not. Does this sound familiar? Does this sound familiar to you at all? Does this sound like what's going on in our nation today? These people began to tear themselves apart from the inside. Why is that? Because Satan doesn't want us to prosper. Satan doesn't want them to prosper. He wants to see to it that things happen. So you don't have to worry so much about somebody coming in and conquering you, because you're conquering yourself from within. And they're beginning to weaken their state that was powerful and controlled a lot of territory. They're beginning to weaken who they were. During the reign of John Hyrcanus, the Sadducees began to become strong. So that's the reason I'm bringing them up when it has to do with John Hyrcanus. And he helped strengthen them. He believed that he was so great and his faith so strong that he was above influence. Who's that strong? Nobody. He was dead wrong. The Talmud, Kedushin 66a, records the key incident that changed him. He threw a banquet for members of the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin are the ruling, like the court, we would say the Supreme Court of Israel. They were the ones that made the decisions for Israel. You read about the Sanhedrin in the New Testament as well. But he threw a banquet for them, and one of them accused him of being illegitimate, saying his mother was raped when she was in captivity. Well, that would tick you off a little bit. So, furious, he demanded an inquiry. Well, she was found innocent, but found out it was not true. But because of that, that's what turned him towards the Sadducees and away from the Sanhedrin. Instead of the traditional Jewish leadership that was there, he was more in favor of the Sadducees, and it allowed them to grow and to grow more powerful. So, let's take a look here where we've gotten. Abraham was promised the land. So that's where we as Christians start. That land that we call Israel today, it was promised to Abraham's descendants. And it was part of the covenant. It wouldn't just say, God didn't just make a covenant with Abraham and said, hey, listen, you can live here. If you want to live here, you can live here. If you want to live where somewhere else, fine. But part of that covenant was the land that they were living on. That makes a difference than any other country that there is in the nation, that God made a covenant with Abraham, and part of that covenant had to do with the dirt that he was living on and that his descendants would live on. His 12 great-grandsons became the 12 tribes of Israel. They returned to the land to inhabit it. So we went through that. We went through the conquest of Babylon, Persia, Greece, that led to the period of occupation and deportation where they hauled some of them off. Then the Hasmonean dynasty led to the repopulation and control of the area of that we call the Promised Land to the Jews. That's where we've gotten through. Through all these empires and dynasties, who lived in the land that we today call Israel? Through all this time from Abraham, who lived in this land? The Jews lived there. Did other people live there as well? Yes, there were different tribes, different ones at different times, depending on what period of history that you looked. And you remember the Northern Empire, what they called when the Northern Empire split from the Southern Empire under Rehoboam, the son of Solomon. You remember eventually in 722 BC, the Northern Empire was conquered by the Assyrians, and the Assyrians took some of them captive, but also sent other people from different places in the Assyrian Empire into there to intermingle with them and make them where they were not of a pure race anymore, which would dilute their power to some degree. So it says, through all these empires and dynasties, who lived in the land? Jews lived in the land. Even the Samaritans were Jews. They were not necessarily full-blood Jews, but they were Jews. And in the land of Judah, they had Jews living there, even across on the other side of the Jordan River, Sea of Galilee. For instance, in the New Testament, you read a lot about the Sea of Galilee. And one of the reasons you do is because, and you read about the town of Capernaum, is because Jesus pretty much made his center for his ministry Capernaum, the city of Capernaum. You read more about him being there than anywhere else. There's reasons given why, and it's not really that important why, but some people say that he went there as the center in order to get away from the center in Jerusalem and so on, because the Jews were so powerful and they wanted to kill him and destroy it. So his ministry could increase and his influence could increase. He went to a place outside of there. Do I know that's true? No. Is it possible? It's possible. A new power was increasingly making its presence felt in the region, the Roman Empire. Did they make themselves felt in many regions of the world at that time? They conquered. You know, one of the most powerful things that the Roman legion, they instituted, but the Roman legion, what they armed them with was a sword that was a short sword instead of the long ones like they had before that's hard to wield. It was a short sword, and it was double-edged sword, so you could cut both ways. And you arm them with this back in those days, and with the shield, different things that they did, and the way that they instituted warfare under their kingdom, they conquered a lot of people, a lot of territory. It says the Roman Empire. It should be noted that scholars date the start of the Roman Empire to about 27 BC. This is when it started as a confederation of different people groups in the northern parts of the Mediterranean and so on. But they eventually wound up controlling a lot of it. When the Roman leader Octavian took the name Augustus, does that sound familiar? We just got through Christmas. And you're reading about when Augustus, and it says when Quirinius was governor of Syria, it pins it down to this particular time. So Octavian was his name, but he took the name Augustus. Before this, that Rome was considered a republic. At this particular time, it became an empire under Augustus and became what it became for many years. People of the first century BC Palestine would have known that they were dealing with a major conquering power, that is, an empire. You could not have been in the Middle East or anywhere in Europe, in that area at that day, without having some influence and knowing something about the Roman Empire. Because they were, the Grecian Empire, Alexander the Great conquered a lot of places. In less than 10 years' time, he conquered all of his known world at that time, from Greece all the way over almost to India and so on. But the Romans conquered even more and controlled more area than what he did. He could never quite control all of the British Isles, or the Roman Empire couldn't, but they got close. Before then, scholars called the state the Roman Republic. The people of the first century Palestine would have felt this impact. At the beginning of the Roman Empire's presence in the Promised Land, who lived in the Promised Land? That's the thing I want to get back to each stage we go. At the time of the Roman Empire, who lived in the Promised Land? Jews lived there. Was there other people that lived there? Yes, but the Jews lived there. They had a kingdom there. They had a people there, groups there. And I said, let's backtrack a little. And we're going to look at, instead of biblical things, we're going to look at historical documentation. Second millennium BCE, the Canaanite city-states of the coast were subject to destructive attacks from the sea people. We talked about the sea peoples last time we were together, and these sea peoples is where the Philistines came out of, and it's kind of mysterious where these sea peoples came from. There's not consensus as to where they came from, but they kind of arrived on the scene, and they were a conquering group of people. They were tough, who had previously devastated the coast of Asia Minor and other eastern Mediterranean. The northern Canaanite seaboard cities, Byblos, Tyre, and Sidon, survived their attacks and were soon flourishing. These cities became known in history as the Phoenicians. In the south, Canaanite cities were destroyed, and part of the sea people became the land of the Philistines, which is just a small section where you see the Gaza today was in that areas where the Philistines ruled, and they conquered different ones. And you can read, as you read through the Old Testament, read through King David and through different ones, that they would conquer some, and then the Israelis would conquer some. They go back and forth. They capture different things at different times. So they were powerful people. In the eastern hill country, now this is all I'm reading from, this is historical sources. This is not from the Bible, Christian literature, or anything else. In the eastern hill country, a group of other peoples closely related to the Canaanites had by now established themselves. These were from north to south, Ammonites, Moabites, and Edomites. And all these you'll see over on the eastern side of the Mediterranean, not the Mediterranean, but the Mediterranean, but further over past Jordan, Sea of Galilee, the Dead Sea, and so on. But these kingdoms were there. Now we're going to talk about a fourth group. This is historians talking about this, because there's a couple of different theories here. The fourth group was also establishing themselves in the eastern hill country. Closely related to the other groups, they had quite distinct cultural practices. One striking aspect of the archaeological record is their lack of pork remains. I can tell you, if you check at my house, you're going to find pork remains. Dinah made a pork roast, and we ate some of it tonight. It's good. So I'm glad I'm not part of that group. But they didn't find it. They didn't find any pork remains in this particular area, so they were assuming this was who? They kind of point to it was the Jews. In marked contrast with finds from other parts of Palestine. And there was also indications that circumcision was being practiced. Both of these things point to the Jewish people. This is historical documentation. This is not biblical. This is just, the archaeologists, historians understand this as well. I don't know why they're so confused today, because if you read what they say, although this was, there are competing views among historians, a couple of different competing views about why this was. There is agreement that they did, in fact, inhabit the land continuously from the 2nd century BC forward. According to archaeology, according to history, the Jewish people inhabited this land. Now, we know from the Bible that Abraham came there from Haran. He had come from Ur of the Chaldees with his father Terah, and they got to Terah, and that's where they settled, and his father died, and that's when he came into, God told him to go to the land I'm going to show you in the 12th chapter of the book of Genesis, and that's where they came in. We know that's how they got there. Historians have different debates about how they got there, but they all agree that they were there for thousands and thousands of years. Galilee seemed to have been sparsely inhabited for centuries. And archaeological evidence points to a marked increase in population from this time on. So from the 2nd century BC on, this population began to increase and grow in this area. By the 1st century, the region was overwhelmingly Jewish. This quote comes from a historical source, not from a Christian nor a Jew. But they know from archaeological evidence, from a historical documentation, that it was largely Jews at this particular time. The Samaritans, already in their own lights, at least, adherents of the Jewish religion remained as a distinct population after this time. Their temple, however, was destroyed by the Jews. They came in and destroyed their temple. The people of Decapolis, which we talked about. In fact, let me go to my next map. In Decapolis, which is here, that we're talking about, Idumea and all this was conquered, and they were forced into submission and so on. They became Jews in this particular area, and you see these areas that they're talking about. And the Hasmonean kingdom, this is about 40 BC. The first map that I showed, the two maps, about 100 and some BC to about 40 BC. This is the one that was from 40 BC, showing the different areas of Galilee, Samaria, Judea, Idumea, Perea, Decapolis, and so on, in the Roman province of Syria beginning to come down into that particular area. And that's what you see in this area. They were all inhabited by Jews, whether by force or on purpose. They were all inhabited by the Jews. Mark 6 tells about a man that was possessed of an evil spirit. Here was the Sea of Galilee that we've been talking about, and here's Gadara. This is where he was, where this incident occurred. This was in this particular area. So that's something that happened in the Decapolis. When you hear people talk about Decapolis, that's one incident. There's more in the New Testament about Jesus going into the area called a Decapolis. Think about this. Not a lot of Jewish people, devout Jews, would go into the area of Decapolis, because this is a group of heathens. This was not a real civilized people as far as they were concerned, but Jesus had no problem going in there, and he would go in there and minister to them and so on. And you remember he cast the demons out of this man, and they go into the swine, and when they come to see him, he's sitting there, the guy is sitting there fully clothed, listening to Jesus teach, and they think, what in the world? And you know what they did? It scared them, so they said, we need you to go somewhere else. This scares us, if you can do that. I don't know. If I had somebody around that could cast out devils, unless I had some myself and didn't want them cast out, I'd want him around. They didn't. Romans come to rule the promised land. 47 BC, Pompey. Pompey was defeated, not the city. General Pompey was defeated and killed by the rival Roman general Julius Caesar. You ever heard of him? Antipater, I told you to remember that name from before. Antipater swiftly switched his allegiance to Caesar. He saw the wind. He saw the way the wind was blowing. He said, Julius Caesar is the one I'm in support of. I like these Romans. Swiftly switched his alliance to Caesar and led troops to Caesar's aid, helping him to establish his power in the region. For this, Caesar made Antipater a Roman citizen and appointed him governor of Judea. Now, who was this guy? Antipater was assassinated. and they were killing him right and left. You get in power and you didn't live long. He assassinated about 43 BC, and a coup that brought his enemies to power in Judea. Judea's new rulers were also hostile to Rome and invited the Parthians, Rome's great enemies, to occupy Judea. Was that a good idea? Probably not. Antipater's son, what's his son? Herod. Son thereupon hurried to Rome and persuaded the Senate that he was the man they needed to be in charge of Judea. He would be loyal to Rome and further its interests in this unsettled region. Where was Antipater and Herod from? And were they Jews? That's a question you need to ask. I can tell you where they're from. Herod, on his father's side, was Idumean. What was happening in that area? It was conquered, and they were forced into converting or going somewhere else. So they were proselytes of his father was of the Jewish faith. Now, how sincere, we don't know, but look at the other part. On his mother's side, he was Nabatean. Nabatean was over to the east, And that was in the areas that were of the Arabic regions, and that on the other side of the Jordan River. And so she was not Jewish. His father was Jewish because of becoming a proselyte. His people did. His grandfather did. And to make it to further things with Herod, he married Mariamne I, who was a Hasmonean princess and the second wife of Herod the Great. Her parents, Alexandra Maccabeus and Alexander of Judea, were cousins who both descend from Alexander Jannaeus. So here he goes. He marries into the Hasmonean dynasty when he marries Mariamne the first, and his father is a proselyte of Judaism. His mother is non-Jew. He marries a Jewish princess, if you will. So was he Jewish? So now when you read about Herod in the New Testament, you kind of look at him under a different light. He had made a pact with the Romans. He became the king of the Jews at this particular time. Back to our original questions. At this time, when he became, quote, king of the Jews, who lived in this land? Jews. Who didn't live in this land? Anybody called Palestinians up to this point in history. Everybody agrees with that, okay? Now, I'm not saying anything against the Palestinians or anything. I'm just saying we're getting to what it is to be a Palestinian, where the name came from, but we're not going to do that this week. We're going to do that next time. And you all think, so let's don't get too carried away with this. But you can see where we have come, and does anybody have any questions at this particular point? Because we're going to end here tonight. I was going to go a little further, but I don't think we need to. That's a lot to grasp in one session. But you can see that all through this particular period of time, Jews lived in this land continuously from the time of Abraham all the way to the time of King Herod under Roman occupation. Jews had continually lived in this land. So would you say that Jews up to this point had a right to be there? I would say so. Anybody have any questions or comments?